I hope I'm visible and audible.
Yes, Pranav.
All right. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to deliver this lecture. I'm just going to share my screen, so give me a moment and then we can get started. Okay. Is my screen visible?
Yes, it's visible now.
All right, perfect. So I guess the theme of today's talk is self-evident in some ways. Um, these are ideas that I've been thinking about for a while, and I've sort of been developing them into an essay in recent weeks. So at many levels, what I'm presenting today is work in progress. But through this presentation and the conversations and ideas that will ensue, I hope to be able to develop this further. So I'm going to launch into my talk for today. In the days after Tiger tragically killed a man in Mananthavadi Taluk of Kerala's Wayanad district early in 2023, a minister of the Kerala government issued a statement that was oddly reminiscent of an agenda vigorously advanced by generations of colonial administrators. He provocatively suggested that tigers be culled to curtail populations and prevent conflict. While his calls found scattered resonance among groups and individuals like the Kerala Independent Farmers Association, the Kerala Catholic Bishops' Council, and the ecologist Madhav Gadgil, other influential voices promptly challenged both the logic and constitutionality of this purported solution. Fortunately, no human fatalities have been attributed to tigers in Wayanad since, and the Kerala government has not yet advanced a petition to the central government or Supreme Court to enlarge the scope of legal tiger hunting. Meanwhile, the nation's attention has turned to other headlines spotlighting tigers in better light. In early April, the Prime Minister released a report establishing that there were over 3,000 tigers in India today, a further increase in the species numbers since camera trap-based monitoring was introduced in 2006. In a newspaper interview thereafter, a stalwart of tiger conservation explicated forward-looking approaches to effectively manage human-tiger conflict, while also opining that should India's tiger population rise further and exceed 4,000 individuals, the species may only gain in stature as a pest. While the articulated positions of the minister and tiger conservationist and the constituencies they represent are poles apart, both statements circle back to the same daunting problem: significant gaps in the governance and management of the human-wildlife interface in India, to the detriment of both people and wildlife. In today's talk, I pose three questions. First, why are extreme solutions like culling being advocated in areas like Wayanad, where human-wildlife conflict is many orders of magnitude lower than it is in some other areas of India? Second, given that India's tiger population appears to be approaching the 4,000 mark, even as a species is still absent in about 70% of the country's tiger habitats, is such a cap on the species numbers defensible? And third, what are the intersections between human-wildlife conflict and coexistence and tiger numbers, both current and projected? Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary in Kerala, with over 120 tigers at densities of about 9 tigers per 100 square kilometers, lies within a forest complex that contains India's largest contiguous tiger population, numbering over 730 individuals. These figures may now be a bit dated. They go back to 2018. The high densities of tigers in this two-part sanctuary, comprising of Tholpeti Range and Wayanad South, which are separated from each other, is explained in large part by the proximity of these two blocks to Nagarhole and Bandipur tiger reserves in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu. The success of tiger conservation in this forest complex is undoubtedly testimony to decades of stringent protection afforded to some tiger reserves that has been enabled by the dispersal of tigers out of these areas into the surrounding landscape, including into Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary and other forests of the district. But well-protected source sites contributing to high tiger densities in Wayanad presents only a partial picture of the sanctuary's tiger conservation successes. The less told story is that some protected areas in India with remarkable tiger recoveries, including, for example, Satyamangalam Tiger Reserve and Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary, are also areas where a large number of people, more than 100,000 residents, live within these two reserves, even as many others living outside depend extensively on forest resources. This fact alone provides reason to carefully assess India's deeply entrenched separation doctrine that has made inviolate core areas a prerequisite for effective tiger conservation. Are areas like Wayanad and Satyamangalam mere outliers, or do they provide vital insights about the possibilities and limits of human-tiger coexistence and about alternative tiger conservation paradigms? Before reverting to these contentious and tangled questions later in today's talk, let us first consider the context underlying Kerala's tiger culling proposition. To do so, I perused available information on trends in tiger populations, human populations, and on the ecological conditions in Wayanad that may have enabled tiger recovery. Against this backdrop, I then examined available information on trends in human-wildlife conflict in Wayanad, juxtaposed against other areas where recent tiger recoveries have occurred. Finally, I pieced these and other strands of information together to reflect on why tiger recoveries may have occurred despite the presence of many human dwellings in Wayanad, and also why conflict events in Kerala in particular have triggered recent calls to cull tigers. Only about a decade ago, some 48 odd tigers were estimated to occur in Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary. 7 years later, as many as 120 tigers were documented within the sanctuary, which suggests a threefold increase, assuming that these estimates are comparable because of variations in survey effort and methods. Wayanad's tiger recovery, uncertainty in trends notwithstanding, merits close examination, given that it has occurred in an area where the big cat shares space with over 20,000 people residing in about 18 forest enclaves within the sanctuary. Ecologically, being part of a large cluster of protected areas with high tiger densities, conditions were ripe for tiger recovery in Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary by about 2010. In addition to tigers living within the sanctuary, many tigers residing in nearby Nagarhole, Bandipur, and Madumalai, their populations have also recently burgeoned, had territories that spilled over into Wayanad. Tigers dispersing out from these protected areas would quickly exploit any vacant or thinly populated habitats within Wayanad, and so the population quickly grew. Tiger population recovery in Wayanad was also enabled by high densities of sambar, cheetal, pigs, and other herbivores that tigers prey on. This is indicative both of effective protection and likely of low levels of bushmeat hunting, conditions that rarely exist in tiger habitats with sizable human populations. The recent recovery of tigers in Wayanad establishes that when enabling social, ecological, and management conditions exist, tigers can rebound in areas with extensive human presence and use. Thus, even though there is growing unease and possibly antagonism towards tigers in Wayanad, I argue that the presence of a large tiger population among people exemplifies coexistence. But given growing tensions, can we hope or dream that coexistence will be a sustainable or durable state in Wayanad or in other forests where people and tigers extensively share space? And there's also the question of numbers. If there were fewer tigers in Wayanad than there currently are, is it more likely that coexistence with lower costs for people and tigers would be tenable over the long term? Answers to these questions may only emerge in time, but juxtaposing available data on tiger and human populations and conflict in Wayanad with other areas of India is instructive. There are approximately 370 persons per square kilometer in Wayanad district. Based on internet news articles, 6 human deaths have been attributed to tigers in Wayanad over the last 8 years, with 4 of these deaths occurring in 2015. Several people have also been injured by tigers over the same period. In contrast, in 2 other areas where tiger populations have also grown rapidly in recent years, Taroba in Chandrapur district of Maharashtra and Pilibhit in western Uttar Pradesh, there have been many more human casualties. Reportedly, over 40 people lost their lives to tigers in and around Taroba in 2022 alone. And a similar number of human fatalities were attributed to tigers since 2015. Tiger densities are lower in Pilibhit than they are in Taroba and Wayanad. Human population densities in Wayanad lie between Taroba and Pilibhit. In other areas where tiger populations have also grown in recent years, for example, Manas, Satyamangalam, Rajaji, and Panna, human deaths are very rarely attributed to tigers. In some reserves like Corbett, Kanha, and Kaziranga, where large tiger populations have persisted for decades, human fatalities are rarely attributed to tigers, especially beyond the reserve boundaries. Some of these areas, like Taroba and Panna, accommodate people in buffer zone forests. Whereas in others, the forests are largely bereft of people or settlements. As such, the 10 protected areas of India that support the highest densities of tigers in the country, Wayanad included, have markedly lower human casualties than other protected areas where tigers occur at lower densities. These figures illustrate that the relationships between human population densities, tiger densities, and conflict culminating in human casualties are complex and likely non-linear. More tigers in an area doesn't mean more conflict within or near those forests. Higher human densities in areas where space is shared with tigers may result in increased frequency of conflict, but this relation also seems to be quite inconsistent. In Satyamangalam and Wayanad, we see areas where human casualties are infrequent, even though there are many settlements within the PAs. And in Pilibhit, conflict primarily occurs at the forest edge and in the surrounding agricultural matrix, which tigers also use extensively. While these facts indicate that culling tigers is a misinformed solution to address human-wildlife conflict in Wayanad, they raise important questions about why people do not seem to be as susceptible to conflict with tigers here relative to other protected areas, including some areas where there's less proximity between people and tigers. While there could be many mechanisms that enable space sharing by people and tigers, I focus on 3 plausible explanations, all of which need to be confronted with data to be confirmed or rejected. First, ecologically and behaviorally, for tigers and people to share space without frequent and adverse encounters, tigers need adequate resources by way of prey and areas with good cover to take refuge in that people don't routinely trespass. Where these conditions are met, tigers will be able to assiduously avoid people even in shared spaces. That a large tiger population lives alongside people in Wayanad indicates that these conditions have been met, whether by design, that is through conservation zonation, or because of a combination of the area's vegetation and topography, which affords tigers refuges. These conditions appear to be there. While the core zones of many PAs serve as such refuges, it is also becoming amply clear that in human-dominated landscapes, relatively small but widely dispersed patches of good cover, such as those provided by lantana, sugarcane, thorny prosopis tangles, and rocky outcrops, can also be adequate shelter for tigers. Second, the extent to which these conditions, that is, adequate prey and areas with dense cover that are relatively unperturbed for tigers, exists both within and outside forests will determine the extent to which tigers can successfully exploit areas within working landscapes around protected areas. For example, in Wayanad's wildlife sanctuary, forests outside the sanctuary may be used by tigers occasionally, but farmlands and plantations are likely used much less. In contrast, in parts of Tarai, in Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, extensive sugarcane plantations that shelter wild and feral herbivores and provide dense cover are exploited extensively by tigers for much of the year. Similarly, dense lantana undergrowth enables a species to cannily use forests that ingress into Bhopal city. Third, while tigers may use refuges with dense cover as a behavioral adaptation in human-dominated landscapes, low levels of conflict may also be the outcome of risk avoidance behaviors by people. In areas like Wayanad, where tiger-bearing forests have long been inhabited by people, it can reasonably be inferred that the forest-dwelling Adivasis are familiar enough with the ways of the tiger to stay safe. This implies that they are able to navigate these forests as they go about collecting fuel wood and harvesting honey, fruits, and other forest produce without placing themselves at great risk from tigers. This is not to say that tigers don't exact a toll by occasionally claiming human lives or claiming many heads of livestock each year. But for people, the greater risk is from wild elephants, who are considerably more prone to charging at humans than tigers that will almost inevitably retreat away from approaching people. Wayanad is not unique in this regard. These adaptations and behaviors of people and tigers have been honed over generations. And in other areas where people intimately share space with tigers while rarely falling victim to them, exemplified, for example, by the Gujars of Uttarakhand, diverse Adivasi and other traditional forest dwellers of Parambikulam, Satyamangalam, and Balaghat. Conversely, when tigers enter areas like plantations and farmlands, where their presence is less expected and accepted, calamitous conflict is more likely to ensue. It is perhaps for these reasons that human and tiger numbers have grown in areas like Wayanad and Satyamangalam without a marked rise in the frequency or intensity of human casualties, at least so far. In the light of the above, Wayanad Wildlife Sanctuary emerges as an exemplar site of human-tiger coexistence, where a large tiger population has persisted and even grown despite extensive shared space use with people. How then has it come to become the tiger-bearing protected area where relatively rare conflict events trigger calls to eliminate tigers? Moreover, statistics of human casualty do not reveal the many hidden costs of conflict. In Wayanad and in other tiger habitats, human-wildlife conflict imposes added costs to forest-dwelling and rural agrarian communities who are already disadvantaged by the lack of access to reliable roads, education, healthcare, and jobs, and lack the resources or agency to make changes to their lives to eliminate or reduce such risks. Further, many residents of tiger landscapes may live in perpetual fear of wildlife, which can severely undermine their psychological and material well-being. The loss of human life to a tiger is thus the proverbial straw that can break the camel's back and a potential coexistence tipping point. It is no surprise, therefore, that some such communities may aspire for lives outside the forest. Against the backdrop of the constant risk of constant risk posed by large fierce wildlife, and the many other challenges that come with living in remote habitats. In a state which ranks high on the Human Development Index and has the highest literacy, one of the highest literacy rates in the country, the Kerala minister's call is a response to the demands of an empowered constituency. It is also a card out of the playbook of populist politics at some levels and may not represent the views of many, including those who silently share space with tigers, problems notwithstanding. In Wayanad, the killing of livestock by tigers have provoked lengthy operations to capture such animals. Cattle killing tigers are typically left alone by state agencies elsewhere in India, unless their behavior is seen as putting humans at high risk. That speedy and full compensation, rather than elaborate tiger capture operations and culling, are not the proposed solutions of Wayanad, points to the fact that the state may lack the vision, means, or wherewithal to effectively govern the human wildlife interface. Leaving voters to the mercy of tigers is poor politics. Calls to cull tigers are not driven by a bloodlust, but reflect shrewd political calculus and a sense of responsibility of the state towards its human subjects. But targeting tigers that may have spent a lifetime assiduously avoiding people that they increasingly compelled to share space with is myopic, especially when there are existing provisions to remove so-called problem animals. Yet, such views are sounding an alarm and it seems inevitable that such propositions will only gain volume if the burden of conservation is placed on people. Such calls for drastic action undoubtedly ring loud in the ears of officials and agencies tasked with advancing tiger conservation in India by establishing new protected areas and strengthening management in others. Only a decade ago, 4,000 tigers in India seemed untenable. Today, there are likely well over 3,000 tigers in India, in part because of the success of several of India's 54 tiger reserves. The prospect of sustaining 4,000 or more tigers in India, where forests are increasingly fragmented, and where human populations have more than doubled since the inception of Project Tiger in 1973, is causing some conservationists and forest bureaucrats to suggest that 4,000 tigers are too many tigers. This raises many questions. Why the number 4,000? How does this number align with ground realities, such as the extent of available habitats for tigers in India, and what will we need to do to cap India's tiger population at or around this number? With concerted conservation efforts, and owing to the momentum of decades of tiger conservation in India, it is likely that India's tiger population will span 4,000 individuals within the next decade. While there may be diminishing scope for further increases in tiger numbers in India's premier tiger reserves, populations may grow rapidly in a few areas. For example, Western Rajaji Tiger Reserve and surrounding forests, where prey are abundant, but tiger populations have been depleted in the recent past. Such recoveries have recently been documented in Manas and in Panna tiger reserves. Beyond about 4,000 tigers, it is possible that further population increases will accrue more slowly. Capping India's tiger numbers at 4,000 is thus probably a canny guess of how many tigers India may soon have, based on the extent of habitats where wild prey densities are sufficiently high and protection is adequate for sizable breeding tiger populations to occur and persist. This figure, however, does not take into account the overall extent of tiger habitats in India that can potentially support the species, but where tigers are currently on the brink or locally extinct. Not accounting for areas of the Himalaya, where tigers can also persist, these areas may span about 200,000 or more square kilometers. Tigers have been extirpated or severely depleted in vast regions of India, including Gujarat, several of the Northeast Indian states, and vast expanses of Orissa, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and Andhra Pradesh, for a variety of reasons. Nearly everywhere, hunting through the colonial period and into the early decades of independent India took a huge toll on tigers, eliminating many populations. Elsewhere, remnant populations decimated by hunting slipped into further decline as their wild prey base was depleted by local hunting for bushmeat. Often source populations from which individuals could disperse into these populations were too far away or separated by spots of land with too little cover, and that only hastened the tiger's decline. In several of these areas, generations of people who lived with tigers have passed on, and in others, memories of tigers have faded. Tigers are no longer welcome in some former habitats into which they have dispersed or been translocated. Excuse me. Turning the fortune of tigers across much of the species range, or remaining habitat in India will thus be a costly, long-drawn affair, requiring restoring degraded habitats, enabling the recovery of deer, antelope, and wildlife populations, and entering delicate negotiations and honest dialogue with communities to determine where tigers will be accepted and what forest governance systems and conflict management mechanisms will be locally appropriate. In suggesting that India's tiger numbers somehow be curtailed at 4,000 individuals, it seems implicit that the species recovery in about 70% of its range in India cannot be prioritized. As populations continue to recover and grow, one can only wonder how a certain maximum number will be held. Proposals to cull larger numbers of tigers are unlikely to fructify in the foreseeable future, and translocating animals from one Indian protected area to another may only redistribute populations and may spur population recoveries. Setting limits to tiger numbers also undermines the growing emphasis on connectivity conservation to maintain and restore corridors that can help maintain genetic vigor and facilitate the recovery of small populations, and even help animals adapt to potential climate change impacts on their habitats. Such limits are also contrary to the growing emphasis on strengthening protection for wildlife beyond protected area boundaries. Setting a demographic cap on tigers is thus neither axiomatic nor desirable, and may only be achieved through apathy or turning a blind eye to land use change and habitat fragmentation. To my mind, these calls therefore reflect both a measure of fear and failure that are perhaps tinged with a layer of pragmatism. Setting a ceiling on numbers is a reflection of critical limitations in our collectively ability to effectively govern human-wildlife interface, even for the national animal, and of a tacit admittance that this is an insolvable global problem at some levels. Fear is born out of the recognition that unmitigated conflict, especially when it impacts human life and well-being, gives air to statements such as those emerging from Kerala. They can severely undermine progress made to advance the tiger's cause over many decades. These calls also represent the fact that some groups consider human-tiger coexistence to be an unviable goal. And pragmatism may lie in the realization that in the country's march towards becoming a $10 million economy, the odds are stacked against tigers and the environment at large, as landscapes are rapidly transformed by mega highways, mining, urbanization, and spawning industrial complexes. The resources to bring about tiger recovery in vast empty forests and fragmented landscapes may not materialize. And the alternatives, like finding consonance in the goals of politicians, bureaucrats, state agencies, and civil society to implement inclusive conservation models that can enable space sharing between people and tigers, while drastically minimizing the risks, may be too far-fetched and ideal, at least for now. Some tiger conservationists have opined that India can sustain 10,000 or perhaps even 15,000 wild tigers, should the species conservation be appropriately prioritized. If the extent and productivity of unoccupied habitat areas were the sole criteria, this seems plausible. Many other factors, however, come into play to determine where and how many tigers can be supported. Barring remote areas of the Himalaya, large portions of unoccupied or sparsely populated tiger habitats in India are inhabited by people, including diverse forest-dwelling Adivasi groups. At the heart of the question of how many more tigers India can support, therefore, is the question of whether and where human-tiger coexistence in shared spaces is tenable. I dwell on this question by first examining and weighing evidence for the relative successes of tiger conservation in protected areas that accommodate or exclude people. First, let us take a hard look at the so-called separation model, a cornerstone of the tiger conservation in India that envisions creating inviolate spaces for wildlife. The premise of this model is that breeding tiger populations will thrive in areas that exclude people from tiger habitats. Human disturbance, broadly defined, has been thought to be detrimental to tigers. Separation in Indian protected areas has been achieved to varying degrees through the designation of core and buffer zones that exclude people and permit regulated use respectively. Creating inviolate core zones has required relocating thousands of people out of protected areas, which has both been contentious and complicated. To be sure, tigers have prospered in several reserves with inviolate core zones, prominent among which are Kanha, Corbett, Kaziranga, and Nagarholi. Relocation programs aside, common features of these PAs include diverse habitats that support abundant wild ungulate populations, sizable annual budgets, notably large protection forces, and thriving tourism. Tiger populations at proximately located forest divisions and protected areas, including Balaghat, Ramnagar, and Wayanad, have progressively grown, in part because of tigers dispersing out of these source sites. Studying the successes of these and other tiger reserves provides important insights about how fierce big cats can be conserved. But the picture is incomplete unless we also look at tiger conservation in areas with more variable conservation outcomes. First, over 1/3 of India's tiger reserves, including some protected areas from which people have been relocated, are every bit floundering in their mission to conserve tigers as these select reserves are succeeding. The second is that areas like Wayanad, Satyamangalam, BRT Hills Tiger Reserve, and Katanya Ghat Wildlife Sanctuary in Uttar Pradesh have sizably large or growing tiger populations, despite there being significant numbers of people living within the forests. It is clear that tiger densities in these areas are not as high as they are in Corbett or Kaziranga, and they may never be as high. Nonetheless, tiger densities in these areas are similar to those of other productive tiger reserves, including Taroba and Kanha. While the reasons that some protected areas succeed or fail are too variable and intricate to explicate here, a key takeaway is that tigers may be more resilient or more able to adapt to some forms of human disturbance than is commonly understood or propagated. While tigers may not achieve the highest densities in protected areas with high human presence and use, there is growing evidence that such areas can still support viable populations of the species. Coexistence, with all its complexities, is thus tenable and may underlie the success of many areas where tigers have persisted, seemingly against the odds. This relatively unexplained facet of tiger conservation holds a key to where and how many tigers will occur in the future. While human-tiger coexistence may be an important determinant underlying the persistence of tigers within and beyond protected areas in India, it is neither ubiquitous nor can it be assumed to be the normative state in areas where humans and tigers share space. It is not ubiquitous because it is the outcome of dynamic interacting environmental and social factors. Certain configurations of these factors engender coexistence, especially when there are supportive policies and good governance. Tigers may successfully be able to share space with humans in areas with extensive daytime use when there are adequate refuges, tracts of vegetation, however small, where they can stay concealed, but may not persist in areas where such refuges are too sparse or have too many intrusions for tigers to meet their life history needs, including raising cubs. Tigers will also not persist where there's persistent hostility towards the species. The social and cultural norms and coping mechanisms of diverse groups of residents of tiger landscapes determine the extent to which people are accommodating of tigers. In some contexts, public pressure may encourage mobs or press authorities to hastily eliminate or contain conflict tigers or strain tigers, even when these animals have not caused any great harm to humans. Whereas in other areas, such tiger presence could be viewed as benign. Coexistence cannot be the expected and normative state because without appropriate alignment of diverse social and ecological conditions, tigers will perish or be forced out of shared spaces. It also cannot be a normative state because expecting that people will coexist with dangerous wildlife places an unfair burden on marginalized and often impoverished communities with little recourse and resource to either buffer themselves from everyday risks that tigers and other wildlife pose, or to gain securities and protections against these risks. For India to support as many tigers as it does today, and for populations to grow in the future, it is essential that the species conservation be extended to areas under diverse ownership and management. For example, potentially large tracts of forest will likely come under community management as communities gain their Forest Resource Rights Act resource rights under the Forest Rights Act of 2006. While uh, uh, while the community forest right regions of individual villages may be fairly small, cumulatively these areas will span vast areas as this map depicts. In a study from 2020, we see that as many as 183,000 square kilometers of forests in 4 states of central India, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, and Maharashtra, may potentially come under community forest management. Many of these areas will not look like inviolate protected areas, and not all such areas can support tigers. The forest may be too sparse and fragmented, or with too many people and too few refuges, or too little prey to support tigers. But there will still be many areas where there will be adequate food and cover for tigers, and where their presence will be tolerated by people. But for tigers and other wildlife to be conserved in such areas with decentralized management, strong and stable institutional mechanisms for local forest government will first need to emerge. This is only possible if the government steps up to strengthen such institutional mechanisms, and NGOs in particular will need to support the development of management plans that provide for people but still leave aside space for wildlife. In most contexts, these areas with shared space may not achieve the densities of premier tiger reserves, but tigers will instead be supported at levels that are socially and ecologically supported relative to the local context. In time, the more effectively these and other areas under diverse management regimes can be managed for wildlife, even as they provide for human needs, tiger numbers may eventually climb beyond the cap of 4,000 individuals towards higher numbers that one can only speculate about at this point in time. This is an image from a 2018 paper, and I've forgotten to put the reference here. It was authored by Dr. Kriti Karanth and others. Given the current and future tiger distributions are fundamentally determined by the dynamic intersection of ecology, society, governance, and management, what bearing can the state and conservation agencies have in charting a course for tiger conservation that serves both people and tigers and creates conditions for coexistence? 4 sets of actions come to mind. First is that huge strides need to be taken to strengthen how India governs and manages its human-wildlife interface. Multiple safety nets need to be in place to vastly minimize costs on life and limb, both for people and tigers, and to reduce psychological, transactional, and other costs for people. Reportedly, about 100 people were killed by tigers in India in the last year alone. While the best laid plans supported by bespoke technologies may still not eliminate risks, just as safer cars and well-engineered highways do not preclude road accidents altogether, there are no alternatives to putting in place a suite of measures to preempt and manage human-wildlife conflict. These can include mobilizing networks of local volunteers and trained personnel, aided by technology to provide early warnings, developing well-trained rescue teams and facilities countrywide, devising and deploying evidence-based interventions to manage and animal behavior and to reduce conflict, and by establishing well-functioning incentive programs to offset human costs and losses, and demonstrably increase tolerance towards wildlife. Presently, such systems and measures are piecemeal and partially functional at best in most contexts. Earlier this year, various people at the Coexistence Initiative Consortium and others associated with long-term interventions for human-wildlife conflict management in India eloquently argued how a many-layered approach for conflict management grounded in robust data is essential to make informed decisions to humanely and justly manage the human-wildlife interface. For such transitions to occur, conflict management needs to be the state's priority and not just the forest department's burden. The second is for greater tenurial security of forest dwelling peoples who also need to be enabled and empowered to sustainably manage forests under their stewardship. An aspect that I dwelt on a short while ago. If areas under decentralized forest governance support large mammals, effective multi-tiered conflict mitigation mechanisms will also need to be in place. Unless there are adequate resources for tigers to survive in an area, the prospect of coexistence doesn't arise. The third set of actions are to create enabling conditions for tigers by stemming the demand for and reducing the extraction of wild herbivores that they prey on. Such actions need to be informed by rigorous social science research on the cultural and economic relevance of bushmeat, and through community engagement to identify areas where there is support for formal law enforcement or where local norms to protect wildlife exist or can be reinforced. Then conservation programs will need to be co-designed with communities to bring wildlife back in such areas. This will undoubtedly be a slow process. Tigers are thriving in some protected areas like Wayanad today because there are protections for all wildlife, including herbivores. Decentralized forest management without effective protection cannot replicate such successes easily. Without creating source populations, recovery may be very slow in regions where tiger numbers are greatly depleted. But these source sites do not necessarily have to be free of people, especially if the driver of wildlife decline in these areas was hunting rather than human disturbance. For people and tigers to co-occur and coexist, landscape integrity is also imperative. Tigers are likely to become increasingly scarce in fragmented landscapes and isolated forest patches as time progresses. The loss of connectivity can also disrupt ecosystem processes and diminish ecological provisioning services to the detriment of human well-being. Fragmented landscapes may also exacerbate conflict as edges expand and contact between humans and wildlife increases. Thus, managing landscapes for ecosystem integrity, connectivity, and human well-being is critical to expand opportunities for tiger conservation and human-tiger coexistence in the future. The prescribed action is to maintain and restore connectivity with a broad goal of supporting biodiversity at large and sustaining ecosystem processes. If appropriate conditions exist over time, tigers may find their way into connected habitat patches from where they've been historically extirpated. To conclude, I return to the question, how many tigers are too many tigers? Looking beyond a handful of premier and well-protected areas, such as India's tiger reserves which support large tiger populations, my contention is that ultimately there will only be as many tigers in an area as can be socially supported. By effectively governing the human-wildlife interface, we will be tilling the soil to sow, nurture, and reap the crop of coexistence. This can greatly expand opportunities for tiger conservation and yield dividends beyond those from making investments to painstakingly protect habitats and efforts to segregate people and tigers. Thank you for your time and attention. I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Pranav, for this very well put together talk. It was very enlightening for all of us. So Nicole will help us moderate the Q&A session. We can start with some of the questions on the chat box. I can hold on to my questions for later when we meet, of course. but we can take questions from others.
So Asta had asked a very interesting question. She said that the Adivasis from Satyamangalam said that the forests have become more darker, and tiger does not like the very dark and dense forest, so they started shifting outside the forest. Even this behavior of tigers was mentioned in Tiger Road by Kenneth Anderson. Is it possible that human and tiger interaction increases due to this reason and conflicts arise?
So to provide a quick answer, I think the emphasis of deep, dark, dense forests for tigers is somewhat misplaced. I think tigers are equally animals of edges and secondary forests, as you point out. So if there are edges that are productive, if these habitats support prey, whether wild or domestic, if there's cover, and if there's a degree of protection, tigers will certainly exploit these areas, and they may do really well and thrive in these areas. So I do think that even if we create buffer zones around core zones, there's no reason to believe that buffer zones will support lower densities of tigers and cores in many contexts.
Som has his hand up. Som, you want to go next?
Yeah, thank you, Pranav. That's a really interesting talk. My question is, how much do we know quantitatively about the conflicts in the sense of livestock killings, livestock losses, and deaths, human deaths caused by tigers? I mean, do we have data on this comprehensively for the whole country? Do we know the locations? Do we know the times? Can we use that data to understand more about what makes the likelihood of conflict higher and how one can avoid that?
Thank you for your question, Som. The answer to that is no, there is no existing comprehensive sort of data set or database that has all of these information. It is also a question that's at the very top of our list in terms of analyses that we need to conduct to sort of plan for the future of human-wildlife conflict and more proactive approaches towards conflict management. The data that exists, and certainly data are collected routinely by forest departments. They exist in the registers of individual forest ranges and divisions where entries are made for conflict events, especially when there's some sort of compensation linked to these events. So it's highly dispersed. It's information that doesn't typically exist in a digital format, and it's certainly not in the public domain. Even for human deaths, I don't think there's been meticulous sort of tallies that have been maintained over time, but I think that information is becoming more available. We've been working towards some solutions to start mining media databases to gather as much of this information as is possible. But as you might imagine, we may get more information for human deaths and injuries, but are unlikely to get a lot of information for the loss of livestock, which often goes unreported in the media.
Okay, shall I take the next question from the chat box? So Ravi Chalam had asked that tigers are found across a wide variety and diverse set of habitats, ranging from the arid forest of Ranthambore to the evergreen forest of Western Ghats in the northeast. Not to forget the mangrove forest of the Sundarbans. Density of the vegetation cover is not a limiting factor for tigers, but density plays.
Yeah, I believe it was a response to Asta's question.
Yeah.
We can move to the next one.
Yeah. So
Mohan Raj had his hand up, and then Ravi, maybe. Mohan Raj, sir, are you there?
See, we are looking at Wayanad as an issue. See, the people of Wayanad, forest lands have been encroached by Adivasis, claiming those lands to be theirs for a long time. There have been a lot of firing. This is all I'm saying about 20 years back. So the people in Wayanad are very much agitated against wildlife conservation. So any small issue is blown up. But we need to look at what happens when tigers are coming outside. Wayanad is a district full of coffee estates, and tigers are moving into coffee estates away from the protected areas. They're spilling over. Number of cattle kills are huge, large numbers, and the cost of compensation is very high. When we compare that to Satyamangalam is for the last 200 years, those settlements are fixed. They have not moved out. They have lived there for prosperity. So they are not new to the wildlife. While Wayanad, no, you have got human population. If one looks at the population, it is moving towards the forest bound fringes. Human population, I'm telling. So we need to look at issues where why Wayanad is objecting, why Wayanad is flagging this issue, and how are we going to sort that out? That is what we need to think about.
Thanks very much, Mohan Raj. And I think your comment and interjection is very timely. I think in many areas, when we consider why certain species of wildlife, tigers, other species, have either persisted or perished, the reasons often lie beyond protection alone. And a lot of it comes down to disputes around resources, around land, around access, and around contending or contentious claims on forests. And this is clearly the case in Wayanad. I was trying to get some information on both the out-migration and in-migration of people into this district that I couldn't pull together in time for this talk. But I think all of those factors, as you point out, are key in shaping the attitudes of people towards wildlife, which in turn can influence political action and management decision making. So I do think that in a more comprehensive analysis of the situation, not just in Wayanad, but of other areas where tiger populations need to be recovered, we need a very fine and nuanced understanding of many of these dynamics.
Ravi, you want to go next? And then Neha has her hand up.
No. I didn't have a question. I was just trying to clarify that that was a comment.
That was a clarificatory comment. Okay, thanks. Neha?
Thanks. Thank you, Pranav, for that. Okay, I'm going to problematize, the idea of corridors, because I think it's the elephant in the room. So the government is now looking at the safari model, and therefore my question is, Pranav, is it worth considering large fences in the Indian context? Because this is a question that comes up repeatedly from politicians and also from some citizens of India. An example is Saraska Tiger Reserve that doesn't have any corridors and probably is not likely to have any connectivity, but it was repopulated with tigers anyway. But in other areas which have a lot of conflict, do you think it's worth thinking about large fencing? I'm playing the devil's advocate here. Thank you.
No, that's a good question. And I've seen fences cropping up left, right, and center, often without a lot of thought or planning. And it raises many concerns. So if I were to think about fencing in reserves, and you said there are two kinds of reserves. There are those that have corridors and need to be connected or are connected to other areas. So fences may obstruct movement. So in those sort of cases, it's obvious that there should be no fences, or certainly no fences that prevent movement and dispersal. Maybe there's another category of reserves, and a few here and there, that are isolated for all practical purposes and unlikely to receive individuals from other areas, and therefore maybe fences are justified. I'd say that fences, obviously, the construction of fences is expensive. In areas around Saraska, I don't think there's tremendous conflict in the surrounding matrix, as there might be in Uttar Pradesh. Right, the matrix is not tremendously supportive for tigers and other wildlife because cover is sparse. When you fence animals in, you also fence communities out. And to the extent that we recognize that India's forests belong as much to India's people as they are for India's wildlife, I think one is creating at least as many problems as one is solving by erecting fences. So if fences need to come up, I would be much more in favor of fencing settlements that are constantly being harangued, or settlements where people face crisis from wildlife. Putting fences around these settlements rather than trying to enclose large forests with fences that are both costly to maintain and problematic both ecologically and socially.
Thanks, Pranav. Amrita has a very interesting question for you. It's in the chat box. She says, and I quote, "I completely agree that social tolerance will determine how many tigers we have. My slightly contentious question is, do you think we are growing tigers for the global tiger conservation goal at enormous cost to Indian citizens in conflict zones? Do you think the tiger conservation efforts, conservation bodies, essentially global human constituents, are likely to ever fund mitigation that enhances local lives? Perhaps a conservation payment or credit type transaction."
Thanks for your question, Amrita. It's a complicated question, and so maybe it'll have a complicated answer as well. But here's my take on this. When you ask the question, are we growing tigers beyond numbers that can be locally or socially supported? My thought is, what are we really doing to grow tigers? Right? We are providing a degree of protection, and protected areas call for protection. And because these areas are protected to whatever extent, some of it may be formal, maybe informal, habitats flourish, herbivore populations may flourish, and so on. And then tigers sort of find their place, and populations may grow. So the alternative may be to not protect or not do anything, right? And sort of leave tigers to sort of their own resources without active management support. Now that's not really a conservation model that I know of, or that is active or appropriate in most contexts. But it does raise interesting questions and about what should be, what numbers are tenable in a given area. And my sort of other way of answering this is that we really shouldn't be setting targets for tiger-bearing areas or areas that can potentially bear tigers based on the extent of habitat or the quality of habitat or the promise that habitat may hold to sustain a certain number of tigers. While having that information at hand is useful, while setting our targets, we should really consider information that we don't currently have about, sort of social tolerance, local acceptance, and the degree of risk that communities are willing to put up with to share space with tigers. I think once we have both these pieces of information, if and when we have that, maybe decision making will be more informed and more fair socially. As far as sort of conservation credits and so on go, now and then sort of talk of mechanisms like this arise. These sorts of models have worked in other contexts. But securing sort of sustainable finance for conservation credits, especially when you look at the scale at which tiger conservation needs to be realized in India's landscapes, millions of people, millions and millions of hectares of land. It's hard to think within sort of the current finance and policy framework where these funds will arise from. But obviously, if pilots can be tested in one or more contexts, there may be lessons to be learned.
Thanks, Pranav, for your detailed responses to all our queries. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have today. There are still some questions in the chat box. Maybe I can share them with you offline and we could respond to them when we have more time. Thank you, Pranav, for taking out the time and sharing your experience with us. It's been a great learning curve. And thanks for the presentation. And thanks everybody for participating. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Thanks very much.
Thank you.